Hi guys, today I'm going to read to you chapter 8 and 9 of Mr. Popper's Penguins. Chapter 8, Penguins Promenade. Mr. Popper soon found that it was not easy to take a penguin for a stroll. Captain Cook did not care at first for the idea of being put on a leash. However, Mr. Popper was firm. He tied one end of the clothesline to the penguin's fat throat and the other to his own wrist. "Ork!" said Captain Cook indignantly. Still, he was a very reasonable sort of bird, and when he saw that protesting did him no good, he recovered his customary dignity and decided to let Mr. Popper lead him. Mr. Popper put on his best Sunday derby and opened the front door with Captain Cook waddling graciously beside him. "Ah," said the penguin, stopping at the edge of the porch to look down the steps. Mr. Popper gave him plenty of clothesline leash. "Look," said Captain Cook. Raising his flippers, he leaned forward bravely and tobogganed down the steps on his stomach. Mr. Popper followed, though not in the same way. Captain Cook quickly got up on his feet again and strutted to the street ahead of Mr. Popper, with many quick turns of his head and pleased comments on the new scene. Down Proudfoot Avenue came a neighbor of the Poppers, Mrs. Callahan. With her arms full of groceries, she stared in astonishment when she saw Captain Cook and Mr. Popper, looking like a larger penguin himself in his black tailcoat. "Heavens have mercy on me!" she exclaimed as the bird began to investigate the striped stockings under her house dress. "It isn't an owl, and it isn't a goose." "It isn't," said Mr. Popper, tipping his Sunday derby. "It isn't an Arctic penguin, Mrs. Callahan." "Get away from me," said Mrs. Callahan to Captain Cook. "An anteater, is it?" "Not an anteater," explained Mr. Popper. "An Arctic. It was sent to me from the South Pole." "Take your South Pole goose away from me at once," said Mrs. Callahan. Mr. Popper pulled obediently at the clothesline, while Captain Cook took a parting peck at Mrs. Callahan's striped stockings. "Heaven preserve us," said Mrs. Callahan. "I must step in and see Mrs. Popper at once. I would have never have believed it. I will be going now." "So will I," said Mr. Popper as Captain Cook dragged him off down the street. The next stop was the drugstore at the corner of Proudfoot Avenue and Main Street. Here, Captain Cook insisted on looking over the window display, which consisted of several open packages of shiny white bored crystals. He evidently mistook for polar snow, for he began to peck at the window vigorously. Suddenly, a car wheeled to a nearby curb with a shriek of its brakes, "Errt!" and two young men jumped out, one of them bearing a camera. "Hey, this must be it," said the first young man to the other. "It's them, all right," said the second young man. The cameraman set up his tripod on the sidewalk. By this time, a small crowd had gathered around, and two men in white coats had even come out of the drugstore. Captain Cook, however, was still too much interested in the window's exhibits to bother to turn around. "Hey, you're Mr. Popper of 432 Proudfoot Avenue, aren't you?" said the second young man, pulling a notebook out of his pocket. "Yes," said Mr. Popper, realizing that his picture was about to be taken for the newspaper. The two young men had, as a matter of fact, heard about the strange bird from the policeman and had been on their way to the Popper's house to get an interview when they saw Captain Cook. "Hey, Pelican, turn around and see the pretty birdie," said the photographer. That's no pelican," said the other, who was a reporter. "Pelicans have a pouch in their bills." "I think it's a dodo. Only dodos are extinct. This will make an elegant picture if I can ever get her to turn around." "It is a penguin," said Mr. Popper proudly. Its name is Captain Cook. Cook, said the penguin, turning around now that they were talking about him. Spying the camera tripod, he walked over and examined it. He probably thinks it's a three-legged stork, said the photographer. This bird of yours, said the reporter, is it a he or a she? The public will want to know. Mr. Popper hesitated. Well, I call it Captain Cook. Well, that makes it a he, said the reporter, writing rapidly in his notebook. Still curious, Captain Cook started walking round and round the tripod till the clothesline. The penguin and Mr. Popper and the tripod were all tangled up. At the advice of one of the bystanders, the tangle was finally straightened out by Mr. Popper walking around the tripod 3 times in the opposite direction. At last, Captain Cook, standing still beside Mr. Popper, consented to pose. Mr. Popper straightened his tie, and the cameraman snapped the picture. Captain Cook shut his eyes, and this is the way his picture appeared later in the newspapers. One last question, said the reporter. Where did you get your strange pet? From Admiral Drake, the South Pole explorer. He was sent to me for a present. Yeah, said the reporter. Anyway, it's a good story. The 2 young men jumped into the car. Mr. Popper and Captain Cook continued their walk, with quite a crowd following and asking questions. The crowd was getting so thick, in order to escape, Mr. Popper led Captain Cook into a barbershop. The man who kept the barbershop had, up to this time, been a very good friend of Mr. Popper's. Chapter 9, The Barbershop. It was very quiet in the barbershop. The barber was shaving an elderly gentleman. Captain Cook found the spectacle very interesting, and in order to get a better view, he jumped up on the mirror ledge. Well, good night, said the barber. The gentleman in the barber's chair, his face already white with lather, half lifted his head to see what had happened. Look, said the penguin, flapping his flippers and reaching out his long beak towards the lather on the gentleman's face. So lather is like shaving cream. With a yell and a leap, the gentleman rose from his reclining position, left the barber chair, and fled into the street, not even stopping for his coat or his hat. Gaw! Said the captain. Hey, said Barber to Mr. Popper, take that thing out of my shop. This is not a zoo. What's the idea? Do you mind if I take him out your back door? Asked Mr. Popper. Any door, said the barber, as long as it's quick. Now it's biting the teeth off my combs. Mr. Popper took Captain Cook in his arms, and amid the cries of "Cork, Doc, and Ork," made his way out of the shop, in his back room, and out a door into the alley. Captain Cook now discovered his first back stairway. Mr. Popper discovered that when a penguin has found steps going up somewhere, it is absolutely impossible to keep him from climbing them. All right, said Mr. Popper, panting up the steps behind Captain Cook. I suppose, being a bird, and one that can't fly, you have to go up in the air somehow, so you would like to climb stairs. Well, it's a good thing this building only has 3 stories. Come on, let's see what you can do. Slowly, but unwearingly, Captain Cook lifted one pink foot after another, one step to the next, followed by Mr. Popper at the other end of the clothesline. At last they came to the top landing. Now what? Inquired Mr. Popper of Captain Cook. Finding there were no steps to climb, Captain Cook turned around and surveyed the steps. Now, that went down. He raised his flippers and leaned forward. Mr. Popper, who was still panting for breath, had not supposed the determined bird would plunge so quickly. He should have remembered that penguins will toboggan whenever they get a chance. Perhaps he had been unwise in tying one end of the clothesline to his own wrist. At any rate, this time Mr. Popper found himself suddenly sliding on his own white-clad stomach down 3 flights of stairs. This delighted the penguin, who was enjoying his own slide just ahead of Mr. Popper. When they reached the bottom, Captain Cook was so eager to go up again that Mr. Popper had to call a taxi to distract him. 432 Proudfoot Avenue, said Mr. Popper to the driver. The driver, who was a kind and polite man, did not laugh at his oddly assorted passengers until he had been paid. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Popper when she opened the door to her husband. "You looked so neat and handsome when you started your walk, and now look at the front of you." "I am sorry, my love," said Mr. Popper in a humble tone, "but you can't always tell what a penguin will do next." So saying, he went to lie down, for he was quite exhausted from the unusual exercise, while Captain Cook had a shower and took a nap in the icebox. All right, I will read the next chapters on the next episode of Mr. Popper's Penguins.